Hey adventurer, welcome back to the Weary Wanderer. Tonight we're heaving ho with Elias Thorne, a gunner's mate aboard a pirate ship in the sweltering Caribbean, as he endures one absolutely hellish day of dwindling supplies, a murderous captain, and the charming prospect of trying to blast a merchant ship to bits, while quite possibly being cooked alive by the tropical sun. Before we wade into the gunpowder, grime, and profoundly poor life decisions, if you genuinely enjoy these voyages into history's most uncomfortable professions, do take a moment to subscribe. It truly helps the channel chart its course. And for a bit of global camaraderie, let me know in the comments what delightful, non-life-threatening beverage you're sipping on as you join us, and perhaps what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, find a comfortable spot. You'll definitely appreciate its distinct lack of weevils and splinters after hearing what Eli endured. Perhaps pour yourself another. And let's begin our descent into the sun-scorched, rum-soaked, and utterly brutal world of a Golden Age pirate. The pirate ship Sea Serpent was never quiet and never truly dark. But in the hours before sunrise, the usual noise softened. It became a mix of men's miserable sounds and the creaking of the ship. Down below decks, where the crew slept, it was pitch black. The only light came from glowing green mold stuck to the wet wood. For Elias Thorne, a gunner's mate, sleep wasn't really rest. It was more like giving up to being tired for a short while. It was a quick break from the discomfort that was always part of his life. Eli was squeezed between a fat, sweaty barrel of salt pork and the rough, splintery side of the ship. His bed was just a pile of old, lice-filled burlap sacks. These sacks were thrown on top of gritty stones in the cramped, stuffy space below deck. Calling it below deck was too kind. It was more like a waiting room for hell. The air in here felt thick. You could almost chew it. It stank of old rum, unwashed men, dirty bilge water, vomit, and rat poop. There were at least 50 men crammed in a space meant for half that many, or for cargo that didn't need to breathe. A damp, clammy chill came from the bottom of the ship where seawater leaked in. It mixed with whatever other nasty fluids had collected over months. Eli's shirt was mostly holes held together by string. It was always damp and stuck to his skin like a cold, grimy second skin. Something crawled across his face. Eli didn't move or even try to brush it off. He had gotten used to the ship's many-legged creatures. Cockroaches, as big as a man's thumb and not shy at all, were his constant buddies. They ran over him in the dark. They even checked out his ears and nose. Sometimes it was a rat, its tiny claws pricking his skin. If he wasn't careful, he'd wake up to find them chewing on his tough heels. Tonight it felt like a big cockroach, probably one from near the leaky barrel of sweet molasses. He just hoped it wasn't one of the biting spiders. Finnegan, who slept, or rather gurgled, 2 men away, had a spider bite on his arm. It had swollen up as big as a rotten fruit and was leaking a nasty yellow fluid. Sleep was a fight. To his left, a man called Wheezy snored loudly. His snores were wet and rattly like a man drowning. Sometimes his snores would stop with a choking sound. Then there would be a few scary seconds of silence before the awful noise started again. Eli found himself counting those silent seconds. A dark part of his brain wondered if Wheezy would finally die tonight. To his right, young Thomas from Bristol whimpered in his sleep. He was probably dreaming of the home he'd never see again, or maybe the whipping he got yesterday for spilling the captain's rum. Further down, someone coughed. It was a dry, hacking sound that hinted at serious sickness. This was the usual sound of suffering that helped him fall asleep. He woke up to a sharp, hard kick to his ribs. "Up, Thorne. Get yourself up, you lazy slug. The sun's coming up and so should you." The voice was Finnegan's. He was one of the boatswain's mates, and his mood was as rotten as his breath. His breath smelled like a green cloud floating over Eli. Finnegan gave him another, softer poke. Eli grunted. The sound was part pain, part giving up. His back, like always, hurt badly. The stones under his sacks felt like they had shaped themselves to his spine. Every bone ached. His left leg, the one with the badly healed break, throbbed with a dull, steady pain. It was a constant reminder of a stormy night near an island called Hispaniola. He could feel the grit from the stones on his skin, and the usual dampness that had sunk deep into his bones. The first feeling was always the same, a heavy sense of dread. He hated knowing he'd lived through another night, only to face another horrible day, just like the one before. For a quick moment he thought about just staying put. He imagined letting Finnegan kick him until something important broke. But then his common sense, that bitter little voice of survival, took over. Being dead was probably quiet, but getting killed by Finnegan's boot wouldn't be fun. All right, calm down," Eli mumbled. His voice was rough with sleep and mucus. He pushed himself up. His muscles groaned, and his joints popped like wet twigs breaking. "Hey, adventurer. Welcome back to the Weary Wanderer. Tonight, we're heaving ho with Elias Thorne, a gunner's mate aboard a pirate ship in the sweltering Caribbean, as he endures one absolutely hellish day of dwindling supplies, a murderous captain, and the charming prospect of trying to blast a merchant ship to bits, while quite possibly being cooked alive by the tropical sun. Before we wade into the gunpowder, grime, and profoundly poor life decisions, if you genuinely enjoy these voyages into history's most uncomfortable professions, do take a moment to subscribe. It truly helps the channel chart its course. And for a bit of global camaraderie, let me know in the comments what delightful, non-life-threatening beverage you're sipping on as you join us, and perhaps what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, find a comfortable spot. You'll definitely appreciate its distinct lack of weevils and splinters after hearing what Eli endured. Perhaps pour yourself another. And let's begin our descent into the sun-scorched, rum-soaked, and utterly brutal world of a Golden Age pirate. The pirate ship Sea Serpent was never quiet and never truly dark. But in the hours before sunrise, the usual noise softened. It became a mix of men's miserable sounds and the creaking of the ship. Down below decks, where the crew slept, it was pitch black. The only light came from glowing green mold stuck to the wet wood. For Elias Thorne, a gunner's mate, sleep wasn't really rest. It was more like giving up to being tired for a short while. It was a quick break from the discomfort that was always part of his life. Eli was squeezed between a fat, sweaty barrel of salt pork and the rough, splintery side of the ship. His bed was just a pile of old, lice-filled burlap sacks. These sacks were thrown on top of gritty stones in the cramped, stuffy space below deck. Calling it below deck was too kind. It was more like a waiting room for hell. The air in here felt thick. You could almost chew it. It stank of old rum, unwashed men, dirty bilge water, vomit, and rat poop. There were at least 50 men crammed in a space meant for half that many, or for cargo that didn't need to breathe. A damp, clammy chill came from the bottom of the ship where seawater leaked in. It mixed with whatever other nasty fluids had collected over months. Eli's shirt was mostly holes held together by string. It was always damp and stuck to his skin like a cold, grimy second skin. Something crawled across his face. Eli didn't move or even try to brush it off. He had gotten used to the ship's many-legged creatures. Cockroaches, as big as a man's thumb and not shy at all, were his constant buddies. They ran over him in the dark. They even checked out his ears and nose. Sometimes it was a rat, its tiny claws pricking his skin. If he wasn't careful, he'd wake up to find them chewing on his tough heels. Tonight it felt like a big cockroach, probably one from near the leaky barrel of sweet molasses. He just hoped it wasn't one of the biting spiders. Finnegan, who slept, or rather gurgled, 2 men away, had a spider bite on his arm. It had swollen up as big as a rotten fruit and was leaking a nasty yellow fluid. Sleep was a fight. To his left, a man called Wheezy snored loudly. His snores were wet and rattly like a man drowning. Sometimes his snores would stop with a choking sound. Then there would be a few scary seconds of silence before the awful noise started again. Eli found himself counting those silent seconds. A dark part of his brain wondered if Wheezy would finally die tonight. To his right, young Thomas from Bristol whimpered in his sleep. He was probably dreaming of the home he'd never see again, or maybe the whipping he got yesterday for spilling the captain's rum. Further down, someone coughed. It was a dry, hacking sound that hinted at serious sickness. This was the usual sound of suffering that helped him fall asleep. He woke up to a sharp, hard kick to his ribs. "Up, Thorn. Get yourself up, you lazy slug. The sun's coming up and so should you." The voice was Finnegan's. He was one of the boatswain's mates, and his mood was as rotten as his breath. His breath smelled like a green cloud floating over Eli. Finnegan gave him another, softer poke. Eli grunted. The sound was part pain, part giving up. His back, like always, hurt badly. The stones under his sacks felt like they had shaped themselves to his spine. Every bone ached. His left leg, the one with the badly healed break, throbbed with a dull, steady pain. It was a constant reminder of a stormy night near an island called Hispaniola. He could feel the grit from the stones on his skin, and the usual dampness that had sunk deep into his bones. The first feeling was always the same, a heavy sense of dread. He hated knowing he'd lived through another night, only to face another horrible day, just like the one before. For a quick moment he thought about just staying put. He imagined letting Finnegan kick him until something important broke. But then his common sense, that bitter little voice of survival, took over. Being dead was probably quiet, but getting killed by Finnegan's boot wouldn't be fun. All right, calm down," Eli mumbled. His voice was rough with sleep and mucus. He pushed himself up. His muscles groaned, and his joints popped like wet twigs breaking. The darkness was still complete, but his hands knew what to do. He felt around for his pants. They were stiff with salt and something sticky. And of course, they were still damp. Pulling them on felt like wrestling a cold, dead fish. His boots, or what was left of them, were nearby. He picked one up and shook it out by feel. A small, angry crab fell out and ran off into the dark, making an angry clicking sound. At least it wasn't a scorpion this time. That had been a nasty surprise a few weeks ago. He didn't bother looking for a clean shirt. The rags he wore would do. His tough fingers, which were very skilled in the dark, went to the small, greasy leather pouch on his belt. Inside were the things he needed: a flint and steel, though using it down here could cause an explosion, a clasp knife, and a small, smooth stone he'd found on a beach years ago. It was one of his few unimportant belongings. He checked them by feel. It was a habit he'd picked up from being paranoid. Things often disappeared on the sea serpent. His thoughts were a list of grim facts, the kind that kept a man alive where hope was a dangerous idea. My back's going to quit on me one of these days. Probably today. With my luck. He heard Wheezy let out a very loud, gurgling snore. That cough from Black Bill sounds like he's dying. If he dies, who gets his share of the loot? Not that we'll get any loot. His thoughts turned to his job. Need to check the cannons on the left side. That number 3 gun was kicking back like a wild horse yesterday. If the ropes holding it are worn out, we're all shark food next time we fire. He thought of how little gunpowder they had left. And if the powder's gotten wet in this damn damp air, we might as well be throwing rocks. A new horrible smell washed over him as someone nearby farted loudly and for a long time, Eli didn't even wrinkle his nose. It was just part of the morning's rich experience. He could hear more movement now, the grunts, curses, and groans of other men being rudely woken up. The day was starting, not with a gentle sunrise, but with a loud, shared groan from deep inside a ship already full of misery. The only good thing, if you could call it that, was knowing he wasn't the only one suffering. Misery loved company, and on the Sea Serpent, you could never get away from company, no matter how much you wanted to. He gave his belt one last pat, making sure his knife was still there. It was one small comfort. If things got really bad, he had a quick way out. Or more likely, a quick way to make someone else's day even worse than his. That thought gave him a little bit of grim satisfaction, just enough to face the darkness. Eli crawled his way out of the stinking pit below deck. He felt like a worm coming out of a rotten apple, only to find the rest of the world wasn't much better. The first hint of dawn was a pale, sickly yellow line on the horizon. It wasn't a cheerful, good morning kind of light. It was more like the sky had a bad hangover and was about to be sick. The air up top was a slight improvement over the choking fumes below, but only just. It still smelled like the ship's special blend: old fish, tar, sweat, and the lovely metallic scent of cannons that hadn't been cleaned properly since the last ice age. His first job, even before sampling the cook's latest culinary crime, was his cannons. Eli was a gunner's mate. His cannons were his burden, his daily headache, and, in a twisted way, the only things on board he almost trusted. He limped towards the larboard, left side, where his 3 9-pounder guns sat waiting, probably plotting new ways to injure him. His body felt like a badly tuned fiddle. His back twanged with every step. His bad leg sent up little jolts of, "Hello there, remember me?" pain. His hands, stiff and swollen, felt like he was wearing someone else's wooden gloves as he started his checks. The deck wood was already getting warm under his bare feet. It was a little preview of the giant frying pan it would become later. The sea was a greasy, rolling gray, and the ship swayed gently, just enough to make a man question his breakfast, if he'd been foolish enough to eat it yet. This early light was flat and honest, which was the problem. It showed every bit of dirt, rust, and every rope that was just waiting for a chance to snap. For Eli, this lovely, honest light just meant a lot of work. He started with Hell's Bell, the cannon at the front of his section. He ran a hand over the cool barrel, then poked at the flintlock. He sniffed the cannon's mouth, checking for dampness. Mostly he was checking if any rats had decided it was a good place to raise a family. Satisfied it was only mildly disgusting, he moved to the back end. This was where the real fun began. He checked the heavy ropes, the breechings, that were supposed to stop the cannon from flying backwards and squashing the crew like bugs. One rope looked as trustworthy as a politician's promise. Its fibers were separating, like an old forgotten wig. "Finnegan!" Eli yelled. His voice sounded like he'd swallowed gravel. "Haul your magnificent carcass over here." Finnegan, the boatswain's mate who'd kicked him awake, strolled over. He was already chewing on a piece of hardtack. It looked like something you'd use to pave a road. "What's put a wasp in your britches this time, Thorn?" Eli pointed at the dodgy rope. "This masterpiece of rope making is looking as healthy as a 3-legged dog in a shark tank. If this snaps when we fire, someone's going to be redecorating the deck with their insides." Finnegan squinted at it. He then spat a stream of brown tobacco juice over the side. It probably killed several fish. "Looks fine to me. Just a bit experienced." "Experienced?" Eli snorted. "It's got more experience than our captain has good ideas. It's a bloody surprise party waiting to happen. And we're the surprise. We need a new one from the stores." "Stores are tighter than a drum," Finnegan grumbled, suddenly very interested in a seagull flying past. Captain's orders. Save everything, especially rope. He probably wants to knit a sweater with it. Right. Save rope and lose a gun crew. Brilliant, Eli said, his voice dripping with sarcasm that was probably wasted on Finnegan. Or perhaps we could just ask the cannon nicely not to recoil so hard. Maybe offer it a biscuit. This was the daily joke. Important gear was always falling apart. It was a lottery of what would kill you first, the enemy, an accident, or the sheer stupidity of your own side. A young pirate named Pip, who looked like he still missed his mum, came up to Eli. Morning, Eli. What needs doing? His voice was still a bit squeaky. Morning, Pip, Eli said. His tone was a bit softer for the lad. Pip was new, but he tried hard, which made him a rare bird on this ship. Grab the rammer and sponge for Hell's Bell. We'll give her a good scrub. And keep your eyes on this prize-winning rope here. If it starts to look even more like a pile of wet spaghetti when we're in action, scream. Scream like you've just been told you have to eat Cobb's cooking for the rest of your life. As Pip hurried off, probably to ponder that terrifying thought, Eli checked his other cannons. Bloody Bess was in slightly better nick, though the wooden cart it sat on had a nasty crack. He'd mention it to Cobb, the carpenter who now thought he was a chef. Not that Cobb would fix it. He was too busy trying to figure out how to boil leather. The third cannon, Lucky Shot, a name Eli thought was hilarious, given it usually coughed like an old man with a lung problem, had green gunk around its touch hole. That would need a careful scrape. Fun. The special misery of a pirate's morning in the Caribbean was how fast the heat hit you. 1 minute it was almost cool. The next, the sun was up, trying to cook you in your own skin. Sweat was already trickling down Eli's back. The glare from the water made his eyeballs ache. And the smells of the ship. Oh, the glorious smells. Tar, old sweat, rotting food, and bilge water all got stronger in the heat. It was like the ship was trying to offend his nose personally. There was no escape. Below deck was a sauna. On deck was a barbecue. The first real test of the day arrived with breakfast. Cobb, the ship's cook, and that term was used very loosely, served up a gray lumpy porridge from a big black pot. It smelled a bit like burnt socks and a lot like regret. What, by all that's unholy, is this supposed to be, Cobb? Growled a big pirate named Silas. He poked at the gray stuff with his knife. Looks like something a sick dog threw up after eating another sick dog. Cobb, a small man who wore food stains like badges of honor, puffed out his chest. It's Carpenter's surprise. Good and filling. Got interesting bits in it. What kind of interesting bits? Eli asked. He looked at his own bowl with the kind of fear usually reserved for facing a Spanish warship. He saw a dark lump. Is that a cockroach, Cobb? Or are you trying to sneak vegetables into our diet again? Cobb leaned over and peered into Eli's bowl with genuine interest. Ah, that. Extra crunch, that is. And good for ya. Legs are full of stuff. This daily breakfast comedy was a tradition. Men would complain loudly. Cobb would defend his terrible food with even more terrible excuses. And everyone ate it anyway, because the only other option was to chew on their own feet. Eli forced down a few spoonfuls. The gritty, tasteless goo didn't help the ache in his stomach or the tiredness in his bones. His body was already complaining. All the work from yesterday, pulling ropes, cleaning hot cannons, had made his muscles feel like they'd been flogged. The old pain in his shoulder, from a musket ball that had said a quick hello years ago, was back. Being tired was just part of him now, like his own skin. He'd only been up for an hour, and he already felt like he'd gone 10 rounds with a grumpy octopus. Suddenly, orders were shouted across the deck. Captain One-Eye Silas stomped out of his cabin. His face looked like a rotten cabbage, and his mood was always stormy. He looked at his crew with his one good, bloodshot eye. He didn't look happy. He rarely did. It probably cracked his face. "Look sharp, you disgusting barnacles," he roared. His voice sounded like rocks in a blender. "Merchant ship spotted. Off the starboard side. Looks like a juicy fruit, ripe for the picking. Thorn, are your guns ready to make some noise for me?" Eli met the captain's stare. "Aye, Captain. They'll be ready to bark. But that rope on Hell's Bell is about as strong as watered-down rum." "No excuses, Thorn," Silas bellowed, cutting him off. "Just make it work. I want that ship stopped, not sunk to the bottom, you hear? There's good stuff in her belly, and I plan on getting it." The captain's words sent a strange feeling through the crew. It was a mix of fear, excitement for treasure, and a general feeling of, here we go again. This was it. The hunt was on. Any tiny hope for a boring, quiet day vanished like a fart in the wind. Eli spat on the deck. It was a small "up yours" to the captain, the ship, and his rotten luck. He turned back to his cannons. The day was just getting started, and it was already shaping up to be a barrel of laughs. Not. He saw Pip looking at him, the poor lad's eyes full of questions. "Well, lad," Eli said with a smirk that wasn't exactly cheerful, "looks like we get to find out if Lucky Shot actually hits anything today, or if that experienced rope on Hell's Bell decides it's time for us to pay a visit to Davy Jones's locker. Personally, I'm betting on the rope." He picked up a sponge staff. The wood felt rough in his hand, a familiar miserable feeling. Let's get to it. These lovely ladies won't clean themselves. More's the pity. The sun climbed higher, like it was in a hurry to make everyone suffer. The real work began. The sun, no longer a shy yellow streak, was now a raging white furnace hanging directly overhead. It beat down on the sea serpent with a personal vengeance. The deck planks were so hot Eli could feel the heat scorching the tough soles of his feet. Any piece of metal left in the sun, cannon barrels, hinges, discarded knives, became a branding iron, ready to sear unsuspecting flesh. The pitch in the deck seams softened and bubbled, releasing a sharp, tarry smell that mixed unpleasantly with the ever-present stink of bilge and unwashed bodies. It was only late morning, but it felt like they'd sailed straight into the devil's armpit. Eli's work and the work of his gun crew had become a relentless, sweaty battle against gravity, the ship's roll, and their own aching bodies. Under the captain's bellowed orders to make ready to speak, they were hauling heavy canvas bags of gunpowder up from the magazine, a terrifyingly cramped space deep in the ship. Each bag felt like it was filled with lead, and the constant fear of a spark, a dropped ember from someone's pipe, or just sheer bad luck, hung heavy in the air. One wrong move and they'd all be scattered across the Caribbean in 1,000 tiny flaming pieces. Eli, with his usual caustic cheer, reminded Pip of this at least twice. "Careful with that powder, lad. We want to blow them up, not ourselves. Though, looking at this crew, I'm sometimes tempted." Then came the cannonballs, solid, unforgiving iron, each weighing 9 pounds. They had to be manhandled from the shot lockers to each cannon, stacked neatly beside the gun carriages. Dropping one meant a crushed foot, or, worse, a dent in the deck that would earn the culprit a lashing, or extra duties from the equally sun-baked and irritable boatswain. Eli's muscles, already complaining from his pre-dawn wake-up call, now screamed in open revolt. His back felt like a rusty hinge. His arms burned. The sweat poured off him in rivers, stinging his eyes and making his grip treacherous on the rough iron. Young Pip was struggling, his face pale under a sheen of sweat and dirt. He fumbled a cannonball, which thudded heavily onto the deck, narrowly missing his own foot. "Easy there, Pip," Eli barked. though there was more weariness than anger in his voice. "Those things ain't eggs, but they'll crack your toes just as easy, and then you'll be hopping around like a one-legged seagull and just as useful." He picked up the ball himself, the effort sending a fresh stab of pain through his old injuries. "Use your legs, not just your back. Unless you fancy ending up bent like a pretzel before you're 20. The environmental changes were all for the worse. The initial flat calm of the sea was giving way to a choppy, unsettled swell as the wind picked up from the east. This was good for chasing their prey, the merchant brigantine, which was now a clear, tantalizing shape on the horizon. But it also made the sea serpent roll more unpredictably. The deck became a moving obstacle course. One moment it tilted sharply to port, the next it lurched to starboard. This made every task, aiming, loading, even just standing, a dizzying, frustrating challenge. The glare off the choppy water was blinding, forcing the men to squint constantly, their eyes aching. The air was thick, wet, and salty, making every breath feel heavy. Nature itself seemed to be in a conspiracy to make their lives as difficult as possible. Eli imagined the sun laughing at them, a great fiery bully enjoying their torment. Then came the mistake. They were using the long wooden rammers to push powder charges and wadding down the muzzles of the cannons. It was heavy, awkward work, requiring precise timing with the roll of the ship. One of the other gun crews, led by a hulking, bad-tempered pirate named Greaves, was working too fast, too carelessly. As Greaves's crew rammed a charge into their cannon, the man holding the rammer, a nervous fellow named Jem, slipped on a patch of spilled water, or possibly rum, it was hard to tell. The rammer went in at an angle, jamming hard. "You clumsy oaf!" Greaves roared, his face contorting with fury. He cuffed Jem hard across the head. "Now look what you've done. That rammer's stuck tighter than a barnacle on a king's arse." The situation quickly escalated. A stuck rammer meant a fouled gun, useless in a fight. The other pirates in Greaves's crew started cursing and shoving Jem. Captain One-Eye Silas, hearing the commotion, stomped over, his one good eye blazing. "What's this pig's breakfast of a problem?" he bellowed. Eli watched with a kind of detached resignation. This was standard procedure on the Sea Serpent. A small mistake, followed by shouting, followed by violence, followed by the captain making things worse. He almost felt a twinge of pity for Jem, who looked like he was about to cry or faint, or possibly both. Trying to unjam a rammer from a loaded cannon, even if it wasn't primed, was risky. "This idiot," Greaves snarled, pointing at Jem, "has managed to wedge the rammer in number 4 gun, Captain." "Solid." "Then unwedge it, you slack-jawed imbeciles," Silas screamed. "Or I'll find a man who can, and you'll be swabbing the latrines with your tongues for a month." He then proceeded to offer a series of loud, anatomically improbable suggestions on how to remove it, none of which sounded particularly safe or effective. While this little drama unfolded, providing some grim entertainment, the merchant ship wasn't just sitting still. It was sailing hard, and it became clear they weren't going to give up without a bit of a chase. The pirates on deck started to grumble and shout conflicting advice. "They're heading for that squall line to the north," one yelled, pointing at a bruised-looking bank of clouds that was indeed growing on the horizon. "We're losing ground," another complained. "Should have kept more sail up, Finnegan, you lazy sod." Finnegan predictably told the complainer where he could stow his advice. The tension on board was like a stretched rope, humming with anxiety and aggression. This was the competition element of their day, not just the physical labor, but the constant pressure of the hunt, the fear of failure, and the ever-present threat of turning on each other if things went sour. Eli just focused on his own guns, methodically checking the priming wires and ensuring the slow matches in their tubs were ready, but not too ready. Panicking didn't help. Usually. Then came the false promise. For a glorious half hour, it seemed like everything was finally going their way. The wind shifted slightly in their favor. filling their patched, grimy sails. The sea serpent picked up speed, cutting through the waves with a new sense of purpose. They began to gain noticeably on the merchantmen. A ragged cheer went up from some of the more optimistic or foolish pirates. Even Captain Silas allowed a grim crack of a smile to touch his lips. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be so bad after all. Maybe they'd catch the merchant quickly, take its cargo with minimal fuss, and be drinking stolen rum by sunset. Eli allowed himself a tiny sliver of this hope. Not much, just enough to imagine a slightly less terrible afternoon. He even caught Pip smiling. "See, lad?" Eli grunted. "Sometimes even a cursed ship like this gets a bit of luck." And then, as if on cue, the merchant ship did something clever. It suddenly altered course, angling sharply towards a series of small, rocky islets that Eli hadn't paid much attention to. These islets were surrounded by treacherous-looking reefs, visible as patches of white, angry water. To follow them directly would be suicide for a ship the size of the sea serpent. The captain let out a string of curses that would have made a demon blush. "They're trying to lose us in the shoals. The crafty bastards." The brief moment of hope on the sea serpent died instantly, replaced by a fresh wave of frustration and cursing. They'd have to go the long way around, losing precious time and distance. The squall line to the north now looked closer, darker, and more threatening. The sun, if possible, felt even hotter. The extra work of maneuvering the ship, trimming sails, and preparing for a potentially more complicated engagement began immediately. Loads that had felt heavy before now felt like mountains. The brief taste of optimism had only made the return to their usual state of grinding misery even more bitter. Eli sighed, the sound lost in the wind and the creak of the rigging. He looked at Pip, whose face had fallen. "Rule number 1 on this ship, lad," Eli said, his voice flat. "If something looks like it's going right, don't trust it. It's just the world having a laugh before it kicks you in the teeth again." He spat over the rail. The merchant wasn't caught yet, and the day was far from over. New depths of misery, as always, were still waiting to be discovered. The sun, now a malevolent god squatting at the zenith of the sky, had burned away any hint of mercy from the day. It wasn't just hot, it was a physical weight, pressing down on the sea serpent and everyone aboard. The deck planks radiated heat like the top of a baker's oven, blistering bare feet and making the air shimmer. Metal fittings, hinges, bolts, Eli's precious cannons, were untouchable, searing flesh on contact. Eli had seen a new lad, careless for a split second, lean against a cannon barrel and leap away with a yelp, a red strip already rising on his arm. The boy got a cuff from Finnegan for his trouble, and a cynical piece of advice from Eli. "Stick to wood, lad." Metal's feeling a bit bitey today. Visibility was a nightmare. The glare bouncing off the choppy, gray-green water was like 1,000 tiny needles stabbing at their eyes. Every pirate squinted, their faces tight with discomfort, peering through the shimmering haze at the merchant ship, which was still stubbornly trying to evade them near the treacherous cluster of rocky islets. The wind, which had briefly promised relief, now felt like the breath of a furnace. Hot, dry, and doing little more than rearranging the sweat on their bodies. And the insects. Swarms of tiny biting flies, seemingly born from the oppressive heat and humidity, descended upon the ship. They crawled into ears, up nostrils, into the corners of eyes, their bites leaving itchy, inflamed welts. Slapping at them was a futile, energy-sapping exercise. Most of the crew, Eli included, just endured, adding this fresh torment to the growing pile. This then was the stage set for the worst task of the day: battle. The merchant ship, a brigantine named the Good Intent, a name Eli found particularly ironic given its current predicament, had run out of tricks. Captain One-Eye Silas, purple-faced and roaring like a bull, had maneuvered the sea serpent to cut off their escape. Now the real work, the deafening, terrifying, and utterly brutal work of naval combat, was about to begin. For a gunner's mate like Eli, this was the absolute peak of suffering, the moment when his job became a frantic dance with death. "Thorn, your guns ready to sing their song?" bellowed Captain Silas, his one good eye glinting with a manic light. "I want splinters, Thorn. I want their rigging in tatters. I want them begging us to board." "Aye, Captain, they're primed and ready to argue," Eli shouted back over the rising wind and the nervous chatter of the crew. He gave a final check to Hell's Bell, his most problematic cannon. The frayed, breaching rope looked even more pathetic now, like a single strand of gray hair trying to hold back a bull. "Pip, you stay clear of that rope's backside when she kicks, you hear? I don't fancy scraping you off the mast." Pip, pale but trying to look brave, nodded, his knuckles white where he gripped a powder bucket. "Aye, Eli." The order came. "Run out." With grunts and curses, the gun crews heaved on the ropes, pushing the heavy 9-pounder cannons through the gun ports, their iron muzzles nosing out towards the good intent. The ship creaked and groaned under the strain. Eli's muscles, already on fire, protested with fresh agony. His hands were raw, his palms screaming from hauling on coarse rope and manhandling hot metal. Then the deafening roar. "Fire as she bears." Eli, sighting down the barrel of Hell's Bell, chose his moment as the sea serpent rolled, bringing the merchantman's stern into his sights. He yelled, "Fire!" and jabbed the glowing slow match to the touch hole. Whoomp! The cannon leaped backwards like a kicked mule, the sound a physical blow that slammed into Eli's chest and ears, even through the wadding he'd stuffed into them earlier. Acrid, black smoke billowed out, momentarily blinding him, stinging his eyes, and filling his nostrils with the sulphurous stench of burnt powder. He felt the deck shudder. Through the smoke, he saw, with a grim flicker of satisfaction, that his shot had struck near the merchant's rudder. Splinters flew. A good hit. One small, fleeting positive in an ocean of misery. But there was no time to savor it. The gun had to be swabbed, reloaded, and run out again, all in a frantic, desperate hurry. The heat from the freshly fired cannon was intense, adding to the already furnace-like conditions. Sweat poured into Eli's eyes, blurring his vision. His breath rasped in his throat. His back felt like it was about to snap in two. Around him it was chaos. Other cannons on the Sea Serpent were firing, their roars blending into a continuous mind-numbing thunder. Men shouted, cursed, and screamed, the air filled with the shriek of cannonballs, the crack of wood splintering, and the high-pitched whine of ricochets. The good intent wasn't taking it lying down. Their smaller cannons, probably 4-pounders, began to return fire. A cannonball screamed past Eli's head, so close he felt the wind of its passage, and smashed into the bulwark further down the deck, sending a deadly shower of wooden splinters flying. One of the splinters, long and sharp as a dagger, struck a pirate named Jem, the same one who'd jammed the rammer earlier, in the leg. Jem went down with a horrified shriek, clutching his thigh as blood pumped out between his fingers. No one had time to help him. He just lay there, writhing and screaming, his cries lost in the general din. Eli's body was starting to betray him. A searing cramp shot through his right calf, making him stumble. His grip, slick with sweat and grime, felt weak on the heavy rammer. His vision swam with black spots, partly from the smoke, partly from exhaustion, partly from the relentless, concussive shock of the cannon fire. He felt a wave of dizziness, the very real fear that he might just collapse onto the searing deck. He knew men died this way, not from enemy shot, but from their own bodies giving out under the brutal strain. He took a ragged gulp from the near-empty waterskin at his belt. The water was hot, brackish, and tasted faintly of algae, but it was wet. It barely qualified as hydration, more like a reminder of what real water tasted like. There was no meal, no break, just the relentless grinding work of battle, fueled by desperation and the faint hope of survival. Then came the midday incident, the moment when things went from terrible to catastrophic for Eli's gun crew. They had just reloaded Hell's Bell. Pip was ramming the ball home. Suddenly, with a sickening snapping sound like a giant dry twig breaking, the frayed breeching rope on Hell's Bell parted. It didn't just fray, it exploded into individual strands. "Rope's gone," Eli screamed, a fraction of a second before they fired. But it was too late. He yanked the slow match away, but the cannon, already primed and aimed, just went off. Perhaps a stray spark, perhaps the unstable nature of Lucky Shot's twin sister. Boom! Without the main breaching to check its recoil, Hell's Bell flew backwards with terrifying, unrestrained force. The emergency tackle, smaller ropes meant as a backup, strained and then snapped with sharp cracks. The heavy iron cannon, tons of metal, became a runaway death machine. It slammed into the ship's railing, smashing it to smithereens, then careened wildly across the deck. Men screamed and scrambled to get out of its path. Pip, who had been standing near where the breaching should have been, was struck a glancing blow by the recoiling gun carriage. He was thrown like a rag doll, hitting his head hard against the base of the mast with a sickening thud. He lay still, a trickle of blood starting to run from his temple into the grime of the deck. Eli felt a cold dread wash over him, momentarily cutting through the heat and exhaustion. The cannon, meanwhile, having demolished a section of the starboard railing, teetered precariously, half on and half off the deck, threatening to plunge into the sea. Losing a cannon was a disaster. Losing a man, especially a young lad like Pip, was, well, it was just another Tuesday on the Sea Serpent. But it still hit Eli hard. Captain One-Eye Silas was already screaming blue murder. "The gun! Save the bloody gun, you incompetents. Thorn, get that cannon secured, or I'll have your hide for a sail patch." Securing a loose multi-ton cannon on a rolling blood-slicked deck in the middle of a battle, under a scorching sun, while enemy shot was still flying, was a task straight from the seventh circle of hell. Eli, his heart pounding, his body screaming in protest, rallied the dazed remnants of his crew and any other nearby hands. They dodged flying splinters and the occasional wild shot from the enemy, using spare spars and heavy ropes, struggling to lever and lash the rogue cannon before it either went overboard or decided to take another murderous jaunt across the deck. It was a nightmare of exertion, terror, and brute force. Every muscle in Eli's body felt like it was being torn apart. His lungs burned. His head throbbed in time with the concussive blasts of the remaining cannons. Someone? It might have been Finnegan, for once doing something useful, managed to get a heavy hawser around the breech of Hell's Bell, just as a larger wave rolled the ship. The cannon slid, groaning, back onto the deck, crushing a stack of spare round shot with a sickening crunch. It was back, but it was damaged, its carriage splintered, its future uncertain. Much like Pip, who was now being unceremoniously dragged clear by two other pirates, his face ashen, his fate unknown. The fight with the Good Intent was winding down. Crippled and outgunned, with several visible fires aboard, the merchant ship finally struck its colors, surrendering. A ragged, exhausted cheer went up from the pirates, but Eli barely heard it. He leaned against the hot bulwark, gasping for breath, his body a wreck, his ears ringing, his spirit scraped raw. The peak of suffering had been reached, and it had been every bit as hellish as he could have imagined. The sun beat down, indifferent. The flies still bit. The misery, it seemed, was a constant. The battle was over, a furious, deafening punctuation mark in a day otherwise composed of simmering misery. The Good Intent was theirs, a wounded beast now tethered to their own, its crew sullen prisoners below the Sea Serpent's decks. The immediate heart-pounding terror had indeed faded, but what rushed in to fill the vacuum wasn't relief. It was a vast, soul-sucking weariness, an exhaustion so profound it felt like it had settled into Eli Thorne's very marrow. The sun, beginning its slow, arrogant crawl down the western sky, still blazed with a cruel intensity. Its light, Eli thought, seemed less like a beacon of victory and more like a spotlight on a new stage of dreary, monotonous, and utterly thankless labor. Victory just meant the script changed from terrifying battle to backbreaking cleanup and processing. And the pay was still theoretical. The afternoon's tasks became a nightmarish ballet of mind-numbing repetition, performed by a cast of aching, sweating, and increasingly irritable pirates. Under the relentless, gravel-throated bellowing of Finnegan and the other petty officers, they set about clearing the wreckage. Eli, whose body felt less like a coherent structure and more like a loosely assembled collection of bruises and strained sinews, found himself once again face to face with Hell's Bell, his runaway cannon. Wrestling the dismounted multi-ton brute back into some semblance of submission was a particular torment. Every collective heave on a jury-rigged tackle, every agonizing inch gained with a creaking pry bar, sent fresh waves of fire through his already screaming muscles. His hands, rubbed raw by rough rope and splintered wood during the battle, were now bleeding freely in places, the salt from his sweat and the sea spray turning each abrasion into a tiny personal hell. The deck, still treacherously slick in patches with spilled grog, seawater, and the dark, rust-colored stains of Jem's misfortune, offered precarious footing. One misplaced step, and a man could easily break an ankle or worse. Eli saw one pirate, a lanky fellow named Stitch, go down hard, his curses swallowed by a grunt of pain as his knee connected violently with a ringbolt. Stitch limped for the rest of the afternoon, another casualty of a battle already supposedly won. Once, Hell's Bell was reluctantly subdued and lashed down with enough rope to moor a battleship, looking more like a captured beast than a reliable weapon. Eli's next delight was to inventory the remaining gunpowder and shot for his gun section. This meant counting heavy canvas bags of powder, their canvas rough and dusty, counting cold indifferent iron cannonballs, counting bundles of greasy wadding. All this while his head still hummed like a disturbed beehive from the cannonade, and his vision periodically blurred as if the world were underwater. The numbers, simple as they were, seemed to swim and rearrange themselves before his tired eyes. Was that 27 balls in that pile? Or did I count that one already as part of the 32 over there? His internal monologue was a confused, weary grumble, punctuated by silent, heartfelt curses directed at the universe in general, and Captain One-Eye Silas in particular. He found his mind drifting, escaping the hot deck for brief, tantalizing visions of a cool, clear stream, a tankard of ale that didn't taste of bilge, a bed that didn't crawl with vermin. Then he'd blink. The harsh reality of a stack of iron cannonballs would snap back into focus, and he'd force himself to recount. The fear of a lashing, or worse, being responsible for a gun falling silent in the next inevitable fight, providing a thin, frayed thread of motivation. Right, he'd mutter under his breath. 27. Definitely 27 this time. Unless a rat ran off with one when I wasn't looking. Wouldn't put it past him. The sun showed no mercy. It beat down and down and down, as if determined to bake the very thoughts from their heads. The air was a thick, wet blanket, making each breath a conscious effort. The ship itself seemed to sigh and groan under the oppression, timbers creaking a mournful tune. The pitch in the deck seams bubbling like malevolent black tears. Time became a cruel joke. An hour spent scrubbing the stubborn, burned black powder stains from the deck around the gun emplacements, a task involving harsh brushes, sand, and a lot of elbow grease Eli no longer possessed, felt like an eternity. His arms moved, his back bent and straightened, but it was as if he were trapped in a painting, making the same motions over and over while the sun hung, fixed and glaring, in the sky. Then he'd glance up, a film of sweat and grime blurring his vision, and be startled to see the shadows had lengthened almost imperceptibly. Yet the list of tasks barked by Finnegan seemed to grow rather than shrink. The supposed destination, some forgotten mosquito-infested cove where they'd properly pick the bones of the good intent and attempt to patch the holes in their own floating purgatory, felt as distant and mythical as the lost city of El Dorado. His mental state, already fragile, began to unravel at the edges. At one point, while trying to coil a particularly stiff and uncooperative length of anchor rope, its fibers thick as his thumb, he became utterly convinced it was a colossal, sun-drowsed boa constrictor. He backed away slowly, heart hammering, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow, reaching for the knife that was never far from his hand. It was only when old Silas, the quiet, grizzled pirate, not the captain, gave him a quizzical, pitying look and said, "Fightin' with ropes now, Thorn? Save your strength, lad. You'll need it for when they fight back proper," that the illusion shattered. Eli felt a flush of shame, quickly masked by a grunt. "Sun's got to me head, old man," he mumbled. Or maybe this whole cursed ship is one long bad dream. He wasn't entirely sure he was joking anymore. He found himself mishearing orders, having to ask for them to be repeated, earning glares and curses. The names of his own crewmates sometimes danced just out of reach of his memory. The carefully constructed walls of his cynical detachment were crumbling, eroded by exhaustion and the relentless, oppressive heat. The small, fleeting human moments were like tiny, flickering fireflies in a vast, encompassing darkness, often only visible because of the surrounding gloom. While wrestling with a heavy, splintered spar that had been part of the good intent's damaged rigging, Eli found himself shoulder to shoulder with Greaves. Greaves, the brute whose carelessness, or his crewmates, had led to the jammed rammer that morning, was not a man known for his charm or cooperative spirit. They strained together, muscles bunching, breath rasping, the heat and the sheer awkward weight of the spar uniting them in a temporary unspoken truce against inanimate objects. When the spar finally yielded, sliding into the place they needed it to go, Greaves, without looking at him, grunted, "Could have used you on my old ship, Thorn. You pull your weight." Coming from Greaves, it was practically a flowery compliment. Eli just nodded, too drained for a sarcastic quip. It wasn't friendship, not even close. It was the brief, pragmatic acknowledgement of mutual effort in a world where most effort felt wasted. Later, as the sun dipped lower, painting the undersides of the clouds a bruised purple, he saw Cobb, the carpenter turned cook turned carpenter again, surreptitiously pass a chunk of leftover biscuit and a pannikin of carefully hoarded water to one of the younger prisoners from the good intent. The lad, no older than Pip, looked half dead with terror and dehydration. Cobb, gruff and stained as ever, muttered something that might have been, "Don't go dying on us, pup. Bad for morale." It was a gesture so small, so out of place in the usual opera of brutality, that Eli found himself staring. He wondered if Cobb had a soft spot, or if he just didn't want the bother of sewing another corpse into a hammock. Either way, it was a flicker. Eli promptly told himself he'd imagined it. Kindness was a dangerous infection on a ship like this. The afternoon crisis, when it arrived, wasn't a sudden explosion, but a creeping, sickening dread. The prize crew, led by the scarred and generally unpleasant Sharky, had been over on the good intent for hours, the sounds of hammering and occasional shouts drifting across the water. Now, a boat was returning, and the expressions on the faces of Sharky and his men were enough to curdle milk. Captain One-Eye Silas, who had been attempting to nap in a sliver of shade, his snores sounding like a faulty foghorn, was roused. He was not pleased. "Well?" he roared, his face flushed and puffy. "Report, Sharky." Is she spilling gold from her seams? Or is this another wild goose chase? Sharky, looking even more like his namesake than usual, wiped a sweaty forearm across his brow. Cargo's decent enough, Captain. Sugar, quite a bit of it. Some cotton, too. Worth the trouble of taking her. He paused, and the air seemed to thicken. But there's a problem in the hold. She's taken on water faster than we can bail, sir. And that ain't the worst of it. Spit it out, man, before I lose my patience and what's left of my lunch. Sharky swallowed, his eyes darting around at the listening crew, Eli among them. It's the sickness, Captain. The bloody flux is bad enough, but there's Yellow Jack down there. We found 2 of their crew dead in their bunks, black as pitch, and, well, it ain't pretty. Another 3 are burning up with fever, looking like they'll be joining their mates by morning. A stunned, horrified silence fell over the deck, broken only by the creak of the rigging and the distant cry of a gull, yellow fever. Those 2 words were a death knell on any ship, let alone a crowded, filthy pirate vessel. The dream of easy riches from the good intent suddenly had a very bitter, very deadly taste. The already bone-weary crew felt a new kind of exhaustion, the exhaustion of pure, unadulterated dread. Arguments erupted almost instantly, a ragged chorus of fear and greed. "Sink her!" one man yelled, his voice cracking. "Sink the cursed plague ship before she kills us all." "And lose all that sugar?" Another shot back, though his bravado sounded hollow. "The captain ain't gonna stand for that." Captain Silas himself was, for a rare moment, struck dumb. His one good eye narrowed to a slit, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Greed warred with a primal fear of disease. The sugar represented a fortune, but a ship full of dead or dying men was no use to anyone. The afternoon, which had been a tedious slog of cleaning up after one kind of violence, now shimmered with the threat of a much quieter, but far more insidious, enemy. Eli felt that old, familiar knot of resignation tighten in his gut. Of course, there was plague. It was the perfect cherry on top of a perfect turd of a day. This voyage was clearly cursed by a malevolent deity with a twisted sense of humor. The sun, oblivious, continued its slow, agonizing descent, dragging the endless afternoon with it. The wind shifted, and now it seemed to carry the faint, sweet, cloying scent of decay and disease from the prize ship. Eli looked out at the vast, indifferent ocean, a shimmering expanse of empty promises. The work wasn't done. The suffering wasn't over. And now they had a new, invisible enemy to contend with. He wondered, with a weariness that went deeper than his aching bones, what fresh hell the approaching evening would conjure up. He was almost too tired to dread it. Almost. The sun, a great bleeding eye in the sky, finally began its grudging descent towards the western waves. It was a spectacle of savage beauty, the clouds lit from beneath in hues of fiery orange, deep arterial red, and the bruised purple of a day-old contusion. Normally, such a sight might stir something in a man, a moment of awe, perhaps. But for the utterly depleted crew of the Sea Serpent, it was just a countdown. The fading light wasn't a promise of rest. It was a warning. It signaled new dangers, a desperate scramble to finish impossible tasks, and the galling certainty that Captain One-Eye Silas, a man whose stubbornness was matched only by his greed, would not let a trivial matter, like the complete absence of daylight, interfere with the acquisition of plunder. Plague-ridden plunder, no less. The immediate, overwhelming problem remained the captured brigantine, the Good Intent. The news of Yellow Jack aboard had sent shivers of primal fear through the crew. But Captain Silas, after a brief, furious internal debate that involved much pacing and muttering, had evidently decided that the value of the sugar outweighed the risk to his expendable men. Or perhaps he just liked watching them suffer. Eli wouldn't put it past him. The decision was made. transfer as much of the cargo as humanly or inhumanly possible before full darkness made it utterly suicidal. "Finnegan!" The captain's voice ripped through the weary quiet. "Get a prize crew back on that leaking tub and send Thorn with a longboat crew. I want sugar, damn your eyes, not excuses. Move like the devil himself is biting your arses." A collective, almost silent groan rippled through the men. It wasn't loud. No one dared. It was the sound of spirits already crushed being ground into dust. Eli, who had dared to entertain a fleeting, foolish fantasy of collapsing onto his lice-infested sacks, felt his stomach clench with a mixture of dread and bitter resignation. Of course, he thought. Why would the universe allow me even 10 minutes of not being actively tormented? He was detailed to the longboat, tasked with the lovely job of ferrying sacks of potentially plague-carrying sugar from the sickly good intent to the relatively less sickly sea serpent. In the rapidly fading light, over choppy water, joy. This was the evening push, that treacherous period when exhaustion peaked, daylight failed, and accidents hovered like vultures. Rowing the heavy longboat across the churning gap between the two ships was a battle in itself. The sea had turned a malevolent inky black, the waves slapping aggressively against the hull. Young Davy, the same lad who'd nearly brained Eli with a cannonball earlier, was on an oar near him. In the gloom, Davy's face was a pale smudge, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and seasickness. He fumbled with his oar, sending a shower of cold spray over Eli. "Try to keep the ocean on the outside of the boat, lad," Eli snapped, though his voice was flat with fatigue. "And for God's sake, don't drop that grappling hook when we get there. My toes have suffered enough today." He wasn't just being cruel. A dropped hook in this swell could punch a hole in the longboat's hull or crack someone's skull. Clinging to the side of the good intent was like trying to hug a dying, thrashing whale. The merchant ship wallowed heavily, its timbers groaning. A clear, sweet, yet terrifyingly sickly smell wafting from its open hatches. The sound of a man coughing violently, a wet, racking sound that spoke of lungs filling with fluid, echoed from somewhere within its shadowy depths. It was enough to make Eli's skin crawl. The few lanterns hung from the rigging cast long, dancing shadows, making the deck a confusing, treacherous landscape. Distances were deceptive, and familiar objects took on strange, menacing shapes. Getting the heavy 100-weight sacks of sugar up from the hold of the good intent, across its rolling deck, over the railing, and then safely down into the pitching longboat was an exercise in controlled desperation. The sacks were unwieldy, their rough burlap scratching at already raw hands. The air in the merchant's hold was thick with the cloying sweetness of raw sugar, overlaid with the unmistakable stench of decay and disease. Eli found himself holding his breath as much as possible, a futile gesture against an invisible enemy. Sharky, the pirate in charge of the prize crew on the good intent, was a man possessed, driving his equally terrified men with curses and threats. "Heave, you dogs, heave! That sugar ain't gonna walk itself over." A near miss occurred almost immediately. A pirate, his face barely visible in the lantern light, lost his footing on the slick deck as a larger wave struck the good intent. The sack he was carrying on his shoulder tilted precariously. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked like both man and sack were going into the black water between the ships. He recovered at the last second, an oath tearing from his throat. But the sack slipped, thudding heavily onto the gunwale of the longboat, sending a shock wave through the small craft, and nearly pitching Eli, who was bracing himself to receive it overboard. "God's teeth, watch yourselves up there," Eli roared, his voice raw. "We're trying to collect sugar, not feed the bloody sharks with our own carcasses." The work felt endless, a Sisyphean torment of lift, pass, lower, repeat. Each sack seemed heavier than the last. Eli's back was a solid sheet of agony. His arms felt like lead pipes, and his legs trembled with the strain of maintaining his balance. The realization that they would not stop at sunset had indeed already worked well past it, settled into his bones with the chilling dampness of the night air. There would be no respite. The captain wanted his due, and the crew would pay the price in sweat, pain, and quite possibly, their lives. He saw Finnegan confer with Captain Silas, a brief, animated discussion on the quarterdeck of the Sea Serpent. Silas gestured impatiently towards the Good Intent, his voice carrying faintly over the water a torrent of angry commands. Any faint hope that the captain might see reason, might call a halt due to the plague or the darkness, died a quick, unceremonious death. After what felt like an eternity of this perilous, back-breaking labor, probably closer to 2 or 3 hours into the deepening night, a different kind of shout went up from the Good Intent. Not a shout of exertion, but one of alarm. A moment later, a splash, followed by more shouting. "Man overboard!" or "sack overboard," came a confused cry. It turned out to be both. A pirate, exhausted and careless, had apparently tripped near the makeshift gangplank they were sometimes using, sending himself and his precious sack of sugar into the churning water. Chaos erupted. Lanterns were waved frantically. Men leaned over the rails, peering into the darkness. The immediate concern, Eli noted with a grim internal smirk, seemed to be more for the lost sugar than the lost man. Eventually, after much cursing and fumbling with ropes, the soggy, spluttering pirate was hauled back aboard the Good Intent, more drowned rat than fearsome buccaneer. The sack of sugar, however, was lost to the deeps, a sweet sacrifice to the sea gods, or perhaps just to gross incompetence. This incident, combined with the increasing difficulty and the crew's visible exhaustion, finally persuaded Captain Silas to call a halt to the transfer for the night. The remaining sugar, and the fate of the sickly Good Intent itself, would be problems for the morrow. The row back to the Sea Serpent was a journey undertaken by ghosts. The men pulled on the oars mechanically, their movements sluggish, their faces pale and drawn in the faint starlight. Eli felt like every joint in his body had been filled with ground glass. Climbing the rope ladder back onto the deck of the Sea Serpent was an agony he performed on autopilot. The thought of his wretched sleeping place below, normally a pit of despair, now shimmered in his mind like a vision of paradise. He stumbled towards the hatchway, every fiber of his being crying out for oblivion. The 'tween decks, when he finally descended into its familiar, fetid embrace, was already a chorus of snores, coughs, and delirious mutterings. The air was thick enough to scoop with a ladle. He found his usual spot, a narrow coffin of space between the unyielding curve of the hull and a barrel of something that smelled vaguely of pickled death. He didn't bother with removing his boots, or what was left of them. The effort was simply too monumental. He just collapsed, the impact sending shooting pains through his already battered frame. From the Stygian darkness nearby, old Silas's voice, barely a whisper, reached him. Here young Pip took a bad turn. Sawney's talking about trepanning him if the fever don't break by dawn. Trepanning, drilling a hole in the skull, a death sentence disguised as a cure. Eli grunted, a sound devoid of any emotion beyond utter weariness. The lad's luck is as rotten as ours, then. Captain still set on stripping that prize bare, another voice mumbled, hoarse and resentful. Even if it means we all end up dancing with Yellow Jack. Reckon he'd auction off our skeletons if he thought he could get a shilling for 'em. A dry, mirthless chuckle answered that. Wouldn't put it past him. Greedier than a starving pig in a truffle patch, that one. These were the evening's interactions. Fragments of despair, cynicism, and gallows humor shared between men too tired to be truly afraid, too beaten down to be truly rebellious. Plans for tomorrow? No one dared voice them. Tomorrow was an abstract concept, a distant shore they might never reach. For now, there was only the suffocating darkness, the symphony of suffering around him, and the relentless rocking motion of the ship, a cradle of misery. He closed his eyes, a profound weariness settling upon him, a surrender to the inevitable pain of consciousness. He knew sleep, if it came at all, would be a shallow, haunted affair, offering little solace before the brute reality of another day under Captain One-Eye's merciless reign crashed down upon him. The summons to the evening meal eventually echoed through the fetid, claustrophobic confines of the 'tween decks. It wasn't a polite dinner bell, but a hoarse, impatient bellow from the cook's mate, a man whose voice sounded like he gargled with gravel and rust. Elias Thorne, who had been sprawled in a state of semi-conscious agony, forced himself to move. Each muscle fiber shrieked a tiny, shrill protest, as if personally offended by the command to reanimate. The mere thought of ingesting food, of the mechanical effort of chewing and swallowing, felt like a monumental task, a fresh wave of labor when all he craved was oblivion. The dining hall was, of course, the same cramped, reeking space where they slept, worked, and generally existed. Dim, smoky lanterns cast an orange, flickering gloom, making shadows writhe and dance like attendant demons. Men, looking more like ghouls than sailors in the poor light, jostled and grunted, finding spots on overturned buckets, coils of rope, or simply squatting in the filth. The air was thick with the usual delightful aromas of bilge water, unwashed humanity, stale vomit, and now the added perfume of Cobb's latest culinary adventure. When the slop was finally dished out into their battered wooden bowls, it was, even by Cobb's impressively abysmal standards, a true low point. The hardtack biscuits, small, dense squares of baked flour and questionable integrity, were at least familiar. Eli rapped his against the barrel beside him. It sounded like stone. No weevils scuttled out this time, which was a small mercy. Perhaps they'd given up and sought more hospitable climes. The stew, however, was an insult to the very concept of food. It was a greasy, tepid, brownish-gray liquid, with a film of iridescent scum floating on top. Adrift in this sorrowful sea were a few pale, rubbery lumps of what might have once been salt pork, now boiled into bland submission, and some fibrous, stringy bits that could have been anything from ship's rope to decomposing vegetables. Eli cautiously sniffed his bowl. It smelled faintly of old socks and profound regret. A true feast for the damned, Eli muttered to old Silas, who was inspecting a lump in his own stew with the intense concentration of a scholar examining a dubious ancient text. Think Cobb is actively trying to poison us? Or is he just naturally gifted in the art of culinary sabotage? Silas prodded the lump with a dirty fingernail. Reckon this bit might be from that rat we saw near the galley this morning. Extra protein, eh? He let out a dry, wheezing chuckle. Still, beats that time on the Sea Dog when the cook tried to make soup out of boiled leather aprons. Chewy that was. Very memorable. Eli grimaced at the thought. Some memories are best left to drown in the bilge. He forced himself to take a mouthful. The liquid was thin and tasteless, save for a metallic tang that might have been rust from the pot. The lumps were chewy and defied identification. He crunched on a biscuit, the effort jarring his aching jaw. Around him, men ate with a grim, silent desperation. Some wolfed it down, too tired or too hungry to care. Others, like Eli, picked at it, their faces masks of weary disgust. He saw one scrawny pirate furtively tucking two of his biscuits into a fold in his ragged shirt, his eyes darting around to ensure no one witnessed his pathetic attempt at thrift. Another, bolder, or perhaps just stupider, tried to scoop an extra ladle of stew from the communal pot when the cook's mate wasn't looking, earning him a sharp whack across the knuckles with the heavy wooden spoon and a string of curses. It was a familiar ballet of hunger, suspicion, and the grim reality of never having enough. Eli managed about half his portion before his stomach threatened open rebellion. It was fuel of a sort, but it felt more like adding grit to an already failing machine. The charade of a meal concluded, the next ritual was the utterly futile attempt at bodily maintenance. Eli gingerly poked at the angry red rope burns on his palms, which throbbed with a life of their own. He had nothing but spit and wishful thinking to apply to them. His back felt like it had been used for cannon practice, a solid mass of deep, burning aches. His old leg wound, a souvenir from a Spanish boarding axe, pulsed with a dull, insistent rhythm, reminding him of its presence with every shift of his weight. He ran a hand over his filthy, sweat-stiffened trousers and shirt. They felt like they could stand up on their own. The idea of washing them was laughable. Where? In what? The grimy bucket of communal water was probably worse than the dirt already on him. He scratched absently at his ribs, feeling the familiar tiny bites of lice. They were his most constant companions, more loyal than any shipmate. He felt a profound sense of being saturated with filth, a grime that wasn't just skin deep but had seeped into his very soul. Tomorrow, these aches would be worse, the burns angrier, his patience even more eroded. The cycle was unbroken. Social hour in this subterranean purgatory was a low murmur of exhausted voices, punctuated by coughs and groans. The news about young Pip's declining condition had spread. "Sawney's sharpening his little saw," someone whispered with grim relish. "Says if the boy's brains are swollen, letting out some of the pressure is the only way. Like drilling a hole in a leaky cask." "More like letting out what little sense the lad has left," another voice, rough with cynicism, replied. "Sawney couldn't bleed a pig proper, let alone a man's skull. Poor little bastard. Better off if a shark took him." Eli felt a brief, sharp pang for Pip. The lad was green, but he hadn't deserved this. No one did, except maybe the captain. The conversation, inevitably, turned back to the good intent and its deadly cargo. "Heard the captain say he'll work us double tomorrow to get that sugar off," a pirate known as Black Dog grumbled, his voice heavy with resentment. "Plague or no plague, he wants his bloody prize money." "Aye, and if half of us kick off from the fever, that's just more shares for him and the ones left standin'," added another, his words laced with a fatalistic bitterness. "Smart, ain't he?" in a murderous sort of way. There was a brief muttered discussion about whether refusing to board the prize ship was an option, but it died quickly. Mutiny was a swift road to the yardarm, and Captain Silas wasn't a man to be trifled with, even if his orders were insane. Rumors also circulated about a Royal Navy frigate spotted 2 days' sail to the east, adding another layer of anxiety to their already burdened minds. Were they sailing towards it or away? No one knew. The captain kept his own counsel, and the crew were just pawns in his dangerous game. Preparing for the illusion of sleep was another grim charade. Eli kicked at the lumpy ballast stones beneath his threadbare burlap sacks, trying to find a configuration that didn't involve a sharp rock digging directly into his spine or hip. He gave a half-hearted swipe at a cockroach the size of his thumb that was boldly exploring the edge of his bed. The rat he'd seen earlier, a sleek, greasy fellow with intelligent black eyes, watched him with unnerving composure from atop a nearby barrel. Eli briefly considered throwing a boot at it, but lacked the energy. He laid his clasp knife, its blade honed to a wicked sharpness, on the sacks beside his hip. It wasn't for any specific anticipated attack, but more a talisman, a deeply ingrained habit from years of sleeping in places where a knife was often the only friend a man could rely on. He remembered with a sudden, unwelcome clarity a night on a different ship years ago, when a drunken shipmate had tried to slit his throat for a silver button. The knife had saved him then. It was a small, cold comfort now. And then, the ultimate cruelty. The body, screaming for oblivion, refused to surrender to it. Sleep, true restorative sleep, was a mocking phantom. Every time Eli's exhausted mind began to drift into the shallows of unconsciousness, a searing stab from his back, a fiery throb from his blistered hands, or the relentless itching from his lice bites would yank him back to miserable awareness. The 'tween decks was an orchestra of human suffering. Wheezy's snores still sounded like a drowning walrus. Black Bill's cough had taken on a wetter, more alarming timbre. From the far end of the hold, someone was whimpering, a low, continuous sound of pure despair. The very timbers of the sea serpent groaned and creaked around him, a mournful lament accompanying the human misery within. The air was thick, almost unbreathable, a disgusting cocktail of stale bodies, rotten food, bilge water, and the ever-present fear sweat. He could feel the damp chill of the deep ocean seeping up through the hull, a cold that went bone deep, a cold that the fiercest tropical sun seemed powerless to dispel. Lying there in the oppressive, suffocating darkness, Eli's mind, too tired to filter, replayed the day's horrors. The roar of hell's bell as it broke free, the sickening thud of Pip's head hitting the mast, the terror in the eyes of the good intense crew, the grim news of Yellow Jack. Each memory was a fresh thorn. He imagined the fevers already incubating in his own body, the invisible tendrils of disease seeking purchase. He thought of the endless, repetitive labor awaiting him at dawn, assuming he lived to see it, the claustrophobia of the space, the sheer, unrelenting proximity of so much suffering, felt like being buried alive in a coffin full of dying men. His usual armor of dark humor, his cynical wit, had been stripped away, leaving him raw and exposed to the sheer, unadulterated hopelessness of his existence. He squeezed his eyes shut, not in any real expectation of sleep, but as a gesture of surrender. Surrender to the pain, to the filth, to the endless, grinding misery of it all. Tomorrow would dawn, a glaring, unwelcome inevitability, and it would bring its own unique torments, its own fresh batch of suffering. All he could do was endure, or not. For now, there was only the darkness, the cacophony of his shipmates' troubled sleep, and the constant nauseating roll of the ship, carrying him deeper into the night, towards another dawn he had no reason to welcome. Perhaps, if he was truly unlucky, he might catch a few hours of tormented, dream-filled stupor before Finnegan's boot once again reminded him that his brief reprieve was over. It was a pathetic hope, but it was all he had left. So we've dragged ourselves alongside Elias Thorne through the muck and mire of a single, exceptionally dreadful day. He's a solitary figure etched in gunpowder smoke and grime, a man whose existence seems almost too wretched to be real. But Eli, bless his lice-ridden cotton socks, was far from an anomaly. He was merely one man in a vast, invisible armada of misery, a reluctant recruit in an army of the damned and the desperate. Stepping back from his individual agony, what does the broader, more scholarly spyglass reveal about his world? Trying to count pirates in their golden age, that blood-soaked period from roughly the 1690s to the early 1730s, is like trying to count fleas on a mangy dog while it's actively chasing its tail. They weren't exactly lining up for a census. These were men who lived in the shadows, died in obscurity, and whose names were more likely to be whispered in terrified dockside taverns than neatly inscribed in official ledgers. However, sober historians, peering through the fog of myth and legend, suggest that at the height of this era, there could have been anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 of these nautical nuisances actively preying on shipping lanes at any one time. Imagine that. Thousands of Eli Thornes simultaneously enduring the blistering sun, the maggoty biscuits, the terrifying roar of cannons, and the constant, intimate threat of disease, injury, and violent death spread across the Caribbean, the coasts of North America, West Africa, and even into the Indian Ocean, a veritable brotherhood of brutality. And that's just a snapshot. Over the decades, this golden age sputtered and flared. The total number of souls who took the plunge into this desperate life likely numbered in the tens of thousands. Who were they? A motley collection, to be sure. Deserters from the Royal Navy, fleeing brutal discipline and appalling conditions. Merchant seamen who'd had enough of starvation wages and tyrannical captains. Ex-privateers who found they had a taste for plunder. and no desire to give it up when peace was declared. Unemployed laborers, escaped indentured servants, hardened criminals, and a surprising number of ordinary men pushed to the brink by poverty, war, or sheer, rotten luck. They were the disposable dregs of empires, the forgotten footnotes of burgeoning global trade, men who decided that a short, violent life under the black flag was preferable to a long, miserable one under the yoke of civilized society. Eli's day of torment, then, wasn't an isolated incident. It was a mass-produced nightmare, replicated across countless creaking decks, under countless merciless suns. Think of the collective tonnage of weevils consumed, the oceans of foul water drunk, the symphonies of groans and curses that echoed across the waves. It's enough to make your own minor discomforts feel like a luxurious holiday. Now let's be brutally honest. Was Elias Thorne's chosen profession crucial for the grand march of civilization? Did his suffering enable the construction of majestic cathedrals or the composition of soaring symphonies? Not directly, no. Pirates, by their very definition, were a wrench in the gears of progress, a particularly nasty barnacle on the hull of legitimate commerce. They didn't build empires, they bled them, one captured merchant ship at a time. They didn't chart new peaceful trade routes, they turned existing ones into gauntlets of fear. However, and here's where the historical waters get a bit murky and interesting, their existence was an almost inevitable, if exceptionally ugly, byproduct of the very empires and trade they attacked. The great European powers were engaged in a furious, often barbaric, scramble for colonial wealth. Their navies and merchant fleets were powered by men often treated little better than animals. Imagine being legally kidnapped by a press gang, dragged from your home to serve on a warship where the food was rotten. The pay was a pittance, if it came at all. Discipline was enforced with a whip that could strip flesh from bone, and your chances of dying from disease were astronomically higher than dying in glorious battle, or signing on to a merchantman, only to find the captain was a sadistic tyrant who'd rather see you starve than share a decent ration. This wasn't uncommon. It was often the norm. Suddenly, the prospect of joining a pirate crew, where the food might still be terrible, but at least the loot was shared, somewhat, more democratically, and you had a theoretical say in who led you, didn't seem quite so insane. So, were pirates necessary? Perhaps in the same way that a raging fever is necessary to signal a deep infection. They were a violent, messy, and often fatal symptom of the brutal exploitation and rampant inequality that underpinned the grand achievements of the age. Their depredations forced empires to react, to build stronger navies, to fortify colonial ports from Tortuga to Trinidad, to develop more sophisticated methods of protecting their immensely profitable and often cruelly extracted colonial wealth. Insurance rates for shipping skyrocketed in pirate-infested waters, disrupting the smooth flow of sugar, tobacco, slaves, and manufactured goods that were the lifeblood of imperial economies. In this twisted, indirect way, the collective suffering of men like Eli forced the civilized world to adapt, to change, to spend vast sums on asserting control over the very seas they sought to dominate. They weren't a foundation stone of empire, but they were certainly a persistent, painful thorn in its side, a constant reminder of the lawlessness that lurked just beyond the horizon. A pirate's life was so steeped in irony, it could have pickled a shipload of cucumbers. They were walking, talking paradoxes, wrapped in rags and smelling faintly of rum and desperation. The biggest, most glaring irony was freedom. This was the siren song that lured many a desperate sailor to the black flag. Freedom from the lash, freedom from tyrannical officers, freedom to carve out your own destiny. The reality, as Eli could attest, was often just a different flavor of servitude. Sure, many pirate crews operated under articles, codes of conduct that were sometimes surprisingly democratic, with elected captains and quartermasters who were meant to represent the crew's interests and distribute plunder fairly. But a pirate captain, especially a successful and ruthless one like One-Eye Silas, could still be an absolute monarch. his word law, his displeasure potentially fatal. And the articles themselves? They often prescribed punishments as brutal as any naval code. Marooning on a desolate island, a flogging that could cripple a man, or a swift execution for theft from a shipmate or cowardice in battle. So much for untamed liberty. It was often just a more chaotic, less predictable form of bondage, lived out under the constant shadow of the gallows. Then there was the treasure. Ah, the glittering mountains of gold doubloons, silver pieces of 8, priceless jewels, and exotic silks. This was the dream that fueled 1,000 desperate voyages. And yes, some pirates did hit the jackpot, capturing fabulously wealthy prizes. But what happened to that wealth? Did it translate into comfortable estates and leisurely retirements? For an infinitesimally small number, perhaps. For the vast majority, including our Eli, the treasure was as fleeting as morning mist. Most of it was divided and then almost immediately squandered in the brothels, gambling dens, and taverns of notorious pirate havens like Port Royal or Nassau. A few weeks of riotous, drunken debauchery, and then it was back to sea, broke and desperate again, chasing the next elusive prize. Eli might fantasize about sleeping on a bed of gold, but his reality was lice-infested burlap. He might help plunder casks of the finest Madeira, but his daily tipple was scummy water that tasted of despair. The life expectancy of a pirate was appallingly short. That vast treasure often just bought them a quicker, more spectacular exit from a miserable world. They sought riches but lived, and usually died, in squalor. They saw themselves as rebels, striking a blow against the hypocrisy and greed of powerful nations. Yet, their own societies were often just as hierarchical and violent. They yearned for an escape from the bottom rung of society, but their parasitic existence depended entirely on the very trade and civilization they professed to despise. It was a life built on a foundation of contradictions, a bitter cocktail of defiance and despair. Strangely enough, the fate of pirates like Eli in the history books isn't complete erasure. It's something arguably worse. Radical, almost ludicrous romanticization. The grim, filthy, terrifying reality of their existence has been replaced by the swashbuckling adventures of Captain Hook, Long John Silver, and Jack Sparrow. We get treasure maps where X marks the spot, jaunty eye patches, talking parrots, and thrilling sword fights on sun-drenched beaches. Jolly Rogers fluttering gallantly in the breeze. Where in these rollicking tales is Eli Thorne, doubled over with dysentery in the stinking bilge? Where's the mind-numbing monotony of his daily labor, the constant gnawing fear of infection from a minor wound, the sheer crushing boredom punctuated by moments of abject terror? That's the stuff that gets conveniently airbrushed from the popular image. The gritty, uncomfortable, and often downright disgusting truth of a pirate's life is too mundane, too unpleasant for adventure stories. We remember a handful of exceptionally flamboyant or notoriously cruel captains, Blackbeard setting his beard on fire, Bartholomew Roberts dressing in finery for battle. Their legends, often exaggerated even in their own time, become the template. But the thousands upon thousands of ordinary, desperate sailors like Eli, the men who did the actual work, endured the relentless suffering, and died anonymously from disease or a poorly aimed shot, their individual stories, their daily grind, their quiet desperation, all that is lost. We get the thrilling highlights, not the unending, miserable lowlights that constituted the vast majority of their existence. The erasure isn't of piracy itself, but of its profoundly wretched human reality. So does this pattern of misery, this desperate gamble by those on the fringes, still echo in our modern, supposedly more civilized world? Of course it does. The tricorn hats and flintlock pistols may be gone, but the underlying currents of human desperation and exploitation run deep and strong. We might not see too many wooden galleons bearing down on container ships, though piracy in certain waters is still a very real, very modern threat, complete with automatic weapons and GPS. But look around. Consider the sweatshops where workers toil in appalling conditions for starvation wages to produce cheap goods for wealthier nations. Think of those forced into dangerous illegal mining operations, or agricultural workers exposed to deadly pesticides with little protection. Think of the crews on some unregulated fishing vessels, virtual slaves trapped thousands of miles from home. The desperation that drove a man like Eli to choose the grim lottery of piracy is not an extinct emotion. It's alive and well in any place where legitimate pathways to a decent life are blocked, where poverty is a life sentence, and where the powerful prey on the vulnerable. The allure of easy money, the thrill of rebellion, however ill-fated, the desire to escape a life of drudgery and contempt, these are timeless human impulses. And as long as there are systems that create vast inequalities, as long as there are people who feel they have nothing left to lose, there will be those willing to take immense risks, to live outside the law, to inflict and endure suffering in pursuit of a fleeting dream or simple survival. The weary wanderer, in countless different guises, still walks among us. His story a stark reminder that the past is never truly past, and its hardest lessons often go unheeded. Understanding Eli's day isn't just about understanding history. It's about understanding a dark but persistent thread in the human condition itself. And perhaps, just perhaps, it makes us look a little harder at the comforts we so easily take for granted. So, we leave Elias Thorne, or perhaps the ghost of him, adrift in the sweltering, stinking, rolling hell of the sea serpent. His day, a tapestry woven with threads of misery, exhaustion, fleeting terror, and the faintest, almost invisible strands of grim humor, is finally drawing to its fitful, uneasy close. But what became of him? What became of all the Eli Thorns who populated those wooden worlds of woe? Let's not sugarcoat it with tales of buried treasure chests and comfortable retirements in some sun-drenched cove. That was the dream, the glittering lure. But for the vast majority, it remained just that. A dream that dissolved like sea foam on the shore. The historical reality for men like Eli was brutal and short. If a cannonball didn't suddenly turn him into a red mist, or a musket ball didn't introduce him to a slow, agonizing infection, then disease was always waiting patiently in the wings. Scurvy, with its rotting gums and bleeding sores. Dysentery, the bloody flux, turning a man inside out in the filth of the bilge. Typhus, spread by the very lice that were his constant bedfellows. And of course, the ever-present threat of yellow fever, like the one simmering aboard the Good Intent, ready to sweep through a crew with terrifying speed. Medical care, if you could call Sawney's rum and rust approach care, was more likely to finish you off than fix you. Even if he dodged enemy action and the myriad diseases, accidents were an everyday hazard. A fall from the rigging onto a hard deck could mean a shattered spine or a cracked skull. A swinging boom in a storm could dash his brains out. Mishandling cargo, a loose cannon, a misplaced step in the dark. The ship itself was a constantly shifting, dangerous environment, especially when combined with exhaustion and often copious amounts of cheap rum. And then there was the law. If a pirate ship was captured by the Royal Navy or other authorities, the end was often a short trial, if that, and a long drop from the gallows, their bodies sometimes tarred and hung in chains at harbor entrances as a gruesome warning to others. Dancing the hempen jig, they called it. A grim end to a grim life. The average career of a pirate during the Golden Age was shockingly brief, often just a few years. Some estimates suggest that a man entering the profession had perhaps a 1 in 3, or even 1 in 4 chance of surviving more than 2 or 3 voyages. Retirement usually meant death, one way or another. The chances of Eli Thorne living to a ripe old age, peacefully dandling grand scallywags on his knee, were vanishingly small.